morning. A few months ago I saw a film in one of the local Uniting churches that was hosting this documentary, and the filmmakers were there, independent filmmakers, who took a team of three people, a Palestinian journalist whose family were refugees in Australia a few years ago and is now Australian, a Jewish academic and a retired politician who'd done some work in this conflict area of the Holy Land, so-called Holy Land. They were taken over to explore the issues amongst the people who live in this place. They went into the villages and the challenging areas of Gaza and the West Bank, talking to people who are now refugees from their own homes, who were driven off their homes by the authorities, by soldiers with tanks and guns and bulldozers. Their homes had been destroyed. Some who were living in small villages had their buildings burnt or their livelihood destroyed. Their sheep and flocks either slaughtered or stolen. Their crops were damaged or destroyed. And they were driven off their land, the land that their ancestors had settled in hundreds of years. They also went into the Jewish territories and talked to the Jewish people. Some were Zionists who expect the whole area to come back as a Zion nation under God, a Jewish nation under God, and driving out all the enemies, all those who would threaten this vision. And others who are more moderate and expressed a deep faith and sadness at the pain and the struggle and the conflicts and the oppression of vulnerable and innocent people. There was a whole mixture of views, but it told stories of people, particularly the innocent and vulnerable people who are caught up in the politics of power and strife, in a land that's supposed to be called the Holy Land, where in these stories, particularly Judaism and Islam came up against each other. But Christianity was in there as well. But of course, the strife isn't really religious. It's about political power. It's about revenge and hatred and greed and all sorts of other human things that we bring to bear on many of our conflicts. As I was looking through and thinking about this, I read many stories of innocent, vulnerable people who are suffering. One of them was Abbas. Abbas is not his real name, but the story is told of him. He was a worker in one of the iron factories in Israel, what's called a Gazan worker. He would leave his home in Gaza, cross the border, work in the factory for 3 weeks at a stretch, and then go back home for 3 days break, and then do it all over again. He was in the factory with many others when the hostilities last October in 2023 broke out. And the armies came in, the soldiers came in, and at the end of point of a gun, they drove the Gazan workers, the Palestinians, out. Some were beaten and killed, but others were just told to get out and go to the West Bank. And they made their way over days, hiding, taking refuge in the mountains and surviving somehow to get into the West Bank and into the camps there. He's 100 kilometres from his family, his wife and 4 children, 5 to 14. At the checkpoint crossing the Israeli border, he was stopped and all his possessions and money were stolen from him, but thankfully they left his phone. Others weren't so fortunate, they lost everything. Some were beaten and some were made to disappear. Each day he wakes early in the morning and his one hope is that he can ring and connect with his wife and family, to ensure they've made it through another night under the skies that are filled with bombs and explosions in Gaza. The family have lost their home and they've been living on the streets, in tents, in abandoned buildings, in mosques, wherever they can find a place for refuge. And as he talks to them each day, he's relieved that they're still alive, but the pain of separation and suffering just overwhelms him. He recounts how just a few days ago he was speaking with his daughter. And he's trying to comfort his daughter and she's saying, "Dad, you should be here to die with us. Other families have their fathers to die with them and they're dying with them. Why aren't you here with us? Why haven't we got food? Why are we like this? Questions that he can't answer, and in trying to comfort him, his daughter rather, she says, it's all lies, Dad. You should be here to die with us. His wife described how they had written their names on parts of their body, arms or legs or neck, so that when they die under bombings and their bodies are found, they can easily be identified. She and the older 3 children had written their names on their bodies, but she couldn't bring herself yet to write it on their youngest. It was too painful. And in telling these stories, Abbas is just chocked up with tears and sobbing, and it's the pain of his life. He just wants to get home, sure that they'll all die, but to be with them in their dying. I read these stories and felt the deep pain of life. And that this has the overarching of religion. That people of religion are invested in this. Of course, much of the drivers are politics and power and greed and revenge and hatred and all sorts of things. But some of it masks as religion. And that's evil. This week in Mark's story of Jesus, we come up against this. Jesus, for the last time, is in the temple precincts. The last time before his death. And he looks around and he describes the scribal class, some of the religious leaders, who he says parade around in long flowing gowns to show who they are in the marketplaces and the public venues, to say this is who we are, look at us, pious, religious, good people, honourable. They take the best seats in the feasts and the banquets, the places of honour, and in the synagogues. Look at us. And he speaks of how they recite long, pious prayers, but at the same time devour the homes of widows. This condemnation is about this practice where widows need help. Their husbands have died, they need help to administer their property and finances. And the scribal class are called on because they're faithful, righteous, religious people who do the right thing, surely, for a fee. They do the work, claim their fee, but claim much more. Sometimes they leave the widow destitute, growing rich off the poverty and impoverishment of the vulnerable people. And then as they walk through the temple, Jesus sits before the treasury, the place where people come to offer their money for the work of the temple. He sits, a posture of judgment. And he'll sit outside the temple and offer a similar judgment in the next bit of Mark's story. But here he watches as people come and put money into the treasury. Some can put in great amounts of money. They're very wealthy. And perhaps they make a show of it. Look at me. Look at my generosity. Look at my faithfulness. Look at what I can offer. And then almost anonymously, invisibly, this poor widow, very poor widow comes. And she offers the smallest amount of money, maybe a few cents or a couple of dollars, whatever it is. She offers everything. Everything she has, says Jesus. Did you see that widow? She gave everything she had. And for some, this is an affirmation of her real deep faith over and against those who give out of their excess but make a show of it. But underlying it is a condemnation of a system that will condition even the poorest of the poor, that they have to give everything they have for the sake of the temple and have nothing to live on. To sacrifice everything they are and have for the sake of the temple. The role of the temple in the life of the people was partly to redistribute funds from the very rich and well-off back to the people who need it most, the vulnerable, the widows and the orphans, the people who need help. And yet it's turned that around, and those who live off the temple become fat and wealthy, whilst those who are in need grow impoverished. And Jesus condemns this religiosity that masks greed and masks injustice and masks violence towards other people. And that's what we see in our world. We see all sorts of things that mask greed, mask violence, mask hatred, and fuel conflicts. None more than in the Holy Land, the so-called Holy Land, where religious faith is at a premium, where the religiosity of people is exposed in the grand buildings, in the prayers, in the sounds of call to prayer, and the wailing and the grandeur of some of the churches and the temples and the mosques. True faith, the faith that Jesus calls us to, is grounded in love. It's grounded in compassion, care, kindness, love, mercy, justice. It's about inclusion and peace. It's about reaching out and lifting the poor and the vulnerable up and giving them life. Sharing what we have generously with those who are in need. That's what faith is, and that's what the world needs. We don't need this religiosity that masks violence and hatred. And too often that's what we get. We need the true faith that Jesus invites us to. Faith grounded in love, hope, peace, justice, mercy, forgiveness, reconciliation, relationship. These are the things of God. And we're invited to live into this way.